The air above Willow Creek Estates, a meticulously planned community where conformity was king and individuality was a code violation, thrummed with a sound that sent perfectly coiffed heads peeking through precisely aligned window blinds. It wasn't the distant drone of a commercial airliner or the reshoring whir of a neighborhood leaf blower operated at the designated 10:00 a.m. slot. No, this was the guttural, earth-shaking hope of a Sikorsky A-64 Skycrane, a behemoth usually tasked with hauling bridge sections or rescuing stranded hikers, not delivering architectural statements of defiance to suburban cull, D-sacks. And there it was, suspended like a gleaming copper jewel against the pale blue sky, the turret. My turret, a magnificent, unapologetically ostentatious copper-topped cylinder, a direct and unambiguous response to the tyranny that had dared to infringe upon my fundamental right to smoke meat in my own damn backyard. It swung gently beneath the helicopter, casting a long, dramatic shadow that swallowed Mrs. Henderson's prize, winning, genetically modified petunias whole, probably giving them a much-needed respite from her relentless fussing. Let's rewind a bit, shall we? My name is Douglas, Doug the Ribbinator Rizzoli, a moniker earned through years of dedicated service to the noble art of barbecue. My existence in Willow Creek had been tolerable. I mowed my lawn to the regulation 2.5 inches. I retrieved my trash cans promptly, and I even gritting my teeth the entire time, used the approved shade of whispering wheat for my mailbox post. My backyard was my sanctuary, a fragrant haven where the alchemy of smoke and slow heat transformed humble cuts of meat into culinary masterpieces. The air would hum with the happy sizzle of rendered fat, the laughter of friends fueled by good food and cold beer, and the comforting aroma that to any sane person smelled like pure, unadulterated happiness. Then came the iron fist of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, a shadowy, unelected council whose primary function seemed to be sucking the joy out of suburban living one meticulously worded bylaw at a time. Their latest decree, delivered via a crisp, white, offensively official-looking letter, declared a ban on open, air cooking devices emitting offensive odors deemed detrimental to the aesthetic harmony of the community. Offensive odors! They were talking about the sweet, smoky perfume of freedom, the very essence of a summer afternoon. This wasn't a rendering plant, it was barbecue. The nerve, it felt like a declaration of war on flavor itself, a culinary kristallnacht aimed squarely at my Weber. That's when the seed of an idea, as audacious as it was petty, began to sprout in my disgruntled brain. If they wanted to play lawyer ball with semantics, fine. They banned barbecues. They said nothing about smokehouses. And if they wanted to talk about aesthetics, well, I'd give them aesthetics that would make their beige little hearts palpitate with a mixture of horror and grudging admiration. Thus the turret. It wasn't merely a decorative flourish, a whimsical addition to my property. Oh no. This turret was the glorious, copper-clad crown of my soon-to-be completed, fully operational brick and mortar smokehouse. A smokehouse, I reiterate, that was strategically designed to occupy roughly the same square footage as their beloved beige, painted clubhouse, a monument to blandness where they held their excruciatingly dull meetings and discussed important matters like the proper placement of decorative gourds. As the turret, guided by the precise hand signals of the ground crew, gently kissed the reinforced rooftop of my burgeoning culinary fortress, a wave of shock rippled through the small gathering of neighbors who had cautiously emerged from their homes. Old man Fitzwilliam, whose hearing aids usually filtered out anything more exciting than elevator music, actually dropped his half-eaten prune Danish. Little Tiffany Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's perpetually scowling granddaughter, pointed with a mixture of fear and fascination, and then the air crackled with her unseen presence. Karen Macmillan. The name itself tasted like unsweetened grapefruit and passive-aggressive emails, even before I saw her. I knew she was there, lurking behind her perfectly sculpted U's. Her internal Geiger counter for perceived violations ticking with the frantic energy of a hummingbird's wings. You could practically feel the disapproval emanating from her property line, a palpable wave of suburban outrage that could curdle milk at 50 paces. This wasn't just about barbecue anymore. This was about the fundamental right of a man to engage in the ancient and honorable tradition of smoking meat without the interference of nosy neighbors with too much time and too little flavor in their lives. This was about principle. This was about to get loud, smoky, and spectacularly, deliciously petty. Karen Macmillan wasn't just the president of the Willow Creek HOA, she was its very essence, its cold, beige soul. She moved through the neighborhood not with a friendly wave or a neighborly chat, but with the silent, judgmental glide of a predator assessing its prey. Her primary weapon wasn't a poorly veiled insult, though she had a rapier wit honed by years of complaining about leaf blowers, but the dreaded violation notice, a crisp, official document that landed in your mailbox with the silent finality of a judge's gavel. Her reign had begun with seemingly minor offenses. A crusade against unharmonious mailbox paint colors that resulted in half the street repainting their posts a shade so bland it defied description. Fines levied against homeowners whose dandelions dared to breach the perfectly monocultured lawns, those yellow rebels facing financial penalties for their audacity. Sternly worded emails, punctuated with excessive exclamation points and passive-aggressive smiley faces, dictated the precise lumen output and seasonal appropriateness of holiday decorations. But the barbecue ban, that was her Rubicon, my Alamo. The hill I was prepared to die as, or at least build a very large, very smoky structure on. The morning after the turret's majestic arrival, Karen graced my property with her physical presence. She marched across my meticulously maintained yet somehow still offensive to her sensibilities Kentucky bluegrass, her sensible orthopedic shoes leaving barely a trace. Her lips were a thin, bloodless line, a testament to years of unspoken zeal and spoken disapproval. Her eyes, magnified behind her designer spectacles, held the glacial fury of 1,000 Karens whose coupons had expired. Mr. Rizzoli, she began, her voice a tight, controlled tremor of indignation. What, in the name of all that is aesthetically pleasing, is that monstrosity? She gestured vaguely at the rapidly ascending brick walls of my smokehouse, already casting a long shadow over her meticulously manicured rose bushes, probably giving them nightmares of smoky, flavorful doom. That Karen, I replied, leaning against a stack of cinder blocks with what I hoped was an air of nonchalant superiority, a faint whiff of last night's experimental hickory, smoked garlic clinging to my clothes, is my new smokehouse. Ah, smokehouse. She sputtered, as if the very word was an obscenity, a vulgarity that had no place in the pristine lexicon of Willow Creek. But the barbecue ban. But you see, Karen, I said, my voice dripping with a saccharine politeness that I knew grated on her nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. You banned barbecues. This isn't a barbecue. This, my dear Karen, is a state of the art, climate-controlled, multi-chambered smoking and meat preservation facility. Perfectly legal, I assure you, according to the letter of your ridiculously overreaching and frankly quite poorly written bylaws. Her face, already a delicate shade of suburban outrage pink, deepened to a vibrant, almost alarming purple. This is a clear violation. It's an eyesore of epic proportions. It's practically an industrial complex. It's going to attract things, rodents, people who enjoy flavor. Commercial, I scoffed, feigning offense. Karen, this is purely for personal use. For the long-term preservation of artisanal meats. And perhaps some smoked cheeses, for preparedness. One must be ready for eventualities. I winked, a gesture that I knew sent shivers of pure distaste down her spine. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Henderson's curtains twitching violently. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile flickered across her usually stoic face. Across the street, old man Fitzwilliam, oblivious to the drama unfolding, was attempting to prune his hedges with a pair of salad tongs. The first whispers of smoky sedition were in the air. The following weeks were a symphony of construction. The rhythmic clang of hammers, the insistent whine of power tools, the steady, satisfying thud of bricks being laid by a crew who seemed to share my enthusiasm for this monument to culinary rebellion. Karen, meanwhile, unleashed a torrent of violation notices that arrived with the regularity of a poorly timed sprinkler system. Unapproved shade of mortars too earthy. Excessive percussive noises emanating outside designated construction hours 9:03 m balls. Potential for attracting avian scavengers due to the inherent nature of cured protein storage. But a funny thing happened. The more Karen's outrage intensified, the more the neighborhood seemed to coalesce around me. Little Tiffany Henderson, surprisingly, started leaving small gifts of construction-themed stickers on my doorstep. Old man Fitzwilliam, mistaking the smokehouse for some sort of elaborate bird feeder, offered me his expert advice on attracting rare finches, which I politely, but firmly declined. Even some of the most devout rule followers, the ones who meticulously measured their lawn height with a ruler, started to show cracks in their perfectly manicured facades. I overheard Mrs. Abernathy, whose hydrangeas were legendary in Willow Creek, confiding in her book club that a little smoky aroma might actually be a welcome change from Mrs. Macmillan's incessant discussions about the proper thread count of guest towels. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. Karen's iron grip on Willow Creek was starting to loosen one brick, one smoky anecdote at a time. And my smokehouse. It was rising, brick by glorious brick, a monument to defiance, a beacon of flavor in a sea of beige conformity. a testament to the enduring human need for perfectly smoked pork belly. The smokehouse, when finally completed, was a sight to behold. It wasn't just large, it was architecturally significant, in a deeply subversive sort of way. The rich, earthy brick, the imposing chimney that promised plumes of flavorful smoke, and of course, the magnificent copper turret that gleamed defiantly under the suburban sun, all combined to create a structure that was undeniably the focal point of Willow Creek. It was a middle finger rendered in mortar and metal, a testament to the fact that one man's culinary passion could indeed be larger than an HOA's ego. Inside, it was a pitmaster's paradise, multiple meticulously calibrated smokers, capable of handling hundreds of pounds of brisket, ribs, and anything else my smoky heart desired. A ventilation system that could rival a small wind tunnel, ensuring optimal smoke flow and minimal, offensive odors escaping. And as a final, glorious touch, I installed a sound system that could gently waft the soulful sounds of blues and classic rock across the neighborhood, providing a much-needed soundtrack to our increasingly dramatic suburban sagas. At a responsible volume, of course I wasn't aiming for all-out war, just a strategic campaign of delicious disruption. The inaugural smoke was less a party and more a declaration of independence. I invited everyone in Willow Creek, every single resident except, naturally, the esteemed President McMillan. The aroma that billowed from my chimney that day was a symphony of smoky goodness, a fragrant affront to those delicate sensibilities. Slow smoked brisket that melted in your mouth, pork shoulder so tender it surrendered to the slightest touch, ribs glazed to sticky, caramelized perfection. It was a culinary rebellion on a plate. Neighbors spilled out onto my lawn laughing, sharing stories, and marveling at the sheer audacity of my creation. Even Arthur Abernathy, Mrs. Abernathy's perpetually grim husband, cracked a genuine smile, a sight so rare it was practically a celestial event. Karen, predictably, was a study in silent, simmering rage. I observed her through my kitchen window, pacing back and forth in her living room, her face pressed against the glass, a perfect silhouette of suburban fury. The next morning, the violation notices reached a new level of absurdity. Accusations of creating a public olfactory nuisance, negatively impacting neighborhood property values through excessive brickwork, and the truly baffling potential for attracting Sasquatch due to the primal nature of smoked protein. The neighborhood, once a bastion of beige homogeneity, was now openly, deliciously divided. On one side, the Smokehouse supporters, a growing and increasingly vocal contingent who appreciated good barbecue and a healthy dose of rebellion against petty authority. On the other, the Kareniacs, those who clung to the HOA's rules with the fervor of religious zealots, their fear of non-conformity outweighing their apparent aversion to delicious smells. The tension in Willow Creek became thicker than a pot of Texas chili. Gossip spread like wildfire, fueled by clandestine backyard conversations and increasingly inflammatory posts on the neighborhood's previously dormant Facebook group. Anonymous notes, some praising my courage, others threatening legal action and darkly hinting at the involvement of concerned citizens, appeared in mailboxes. One particularly memorable Facebook post, featuring a crudely photoshopped image of my smokehouse, with a giant plume of smoke shaped like a middle finger billowing from the turret, garnered hundreds of likes and shares, much to Karen's very public sigh and undoubtedly private apoplexy. The HOA meetings, once tedious affairs focused on the minutiae of landscaping budgets and the precise shade of white permitted for porch railings, transformed into raucous, standing room only shouting matches. The Smokehouse supporters would arrive en masse, sporting homemade, free the ribs T-shirts and armed with surprisingly well-researched arguments about the historical significance of open, fire cooking. The Kareniacs, led by their fearless leader, would counter with increasingly desperate pleas for order, decorum, and the elusive community harmony that seemed to have vanished in a cloud of hickory smoke. One particularly memorable meeting saw Mrs. Henderson, usually a picture of quiet, almost timid politeness, rise to her feet, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "Frankly, Mrs. McMillan," she declared, to the stunned silence of the room, "I'd rather smell Doug's delicious barbecue than your incessant complaining about everyone else's perfectly acceptable landscaping any day of the week." The room erupted in applause, a wave of rebellious clapping that echoed through the beige walls of the clubhouse. Karen's face, a mask of incandescent fury, turned a shade of purple usually reserved for overripe eggplants. Decorum had not just left the building. It had been dragged out kicking and screaming and possibly smoked over applewood chips. Karen McMillan, a woman whose commitment to rules and regulations bordered on the pathological, was not one to be deterred by mere public opinion or the tantalizing aroma of perfectly smoked brisket. She did what any self-respecting, deeply offended HOA president with access to community funds would do. She lawyered up. We're talking a prestigious firm whose offices probably smelled of expensive leather and unspoken condescension. A place where paralegals used antique quills to draft cease and desist letters, and the senior partners probably discussed zoning ordinances over vintage port. The certified letter arrived a week later, a thick, intimidating envelope filled with enough legal jargon to induce a migraine in a seasoned Supreme Court justice. It demanded the immediate cessation of all smoking activities and the dismantling of my illegal and aesthetically offensive structure within 10 business days, or face the full wrath of the Willow Creek HOA's legal firepower. My initial reaction was a cold wave of panic. My finances, while generally sound, had taken a significant hit thanks to the unexpected but entirely worth it cost of constructing my architectural act of defiance. The thought of facing a high-powered legal team sent shivers down my spine, colder than a walk in freezer full of uncooked ribs. But then, something extraordinary happened. The story of the Smokehouse rebellion went viral. Little Tiffany Henderson's older sister, a college student with a TikTok account and a flair for the dramatic, posted a short, hilariously narrated video titled, HOA Tyrant Bans BBQ, Guy Builds Literal Castle of Smoke. It exploded. Suddenly my phone was ringing off the hook. Local news outlets wanted interviews. National morning shows wanted to do segments on the Suburban smoke out. My story, the tale of a man standing up for his right to barbecue against the forces of beige conformity, resonated with a nation wary of petty rules and flavorless food. A GoFundMe page, started by a sympathetic neighbor who described herself as a lover of liberty and perfectly smoked pulled pork, quickly amassed a surprising amount of donations. A local barbecue supply company, whose owner declared me a culinary freedom fighter, offered me a lifetime supply of premium wood chips. Even a renowned architect, intrigued by the sheer audacity of my design, offered pro bono advice on how to argue the unique architectural merit of my smokehouse. The legal eagles representing Karen and the HOA were clearly unprepared for this level of public outcry. Their subsequent letters became slightly less aggressive in tone, hinting at the possibility of amicable resolution and mutually agreeable compromises. Meanwhile, the viral sensation that was Castle Karen, the affectionate, slightly mocking nickname the internet had bestowed upon my smokehouse, continued its meteoric rise. Memes featuring Karen's perpetually disapproving visage flooded social media, often juxtaposed with mouth-watering images of smoked meats. T-shirts emblazoned with slogans like, "Smoke M if you got M," and "Down with HABQ," became surprisingly popular, even showing up at local farmers' markets. The local news ran a multi-part series on the BQ bandit and his smoky citadel, portraying me as a working-class hero standing up against bureaucratic tyranny. They even interviewed Karen, who, predictably, looked like she'd just discovered that her prize-winning petunias had been fertilized with, well, let's just say something decidedly unorganic. The pressure on the HOA was immense. Their Facebook page became a digital battleground, a chaotic mess of pro-smoky emojis and angry accusations of flavor fascism. Their email inboxes overflowed with messages of support for the Smokehouse rebellion, many of them featuring creative suggestions for what Karen could do with her violation notices. Even some of the most staunch Kareniacs, those who had previously reported neighbors for leaving their garden gnomes out after dusk, started to waver under the weight of public opinion and the undeniable allure of the smoky aroma wafting through the neighborhood. The next HOA meeting was less a formal debate and more a public spectacle. The clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, with news cameras jostling for position and residents holding up signs bearing slogans like, "Smoke for Freedom," and "Brisket is Bliss." When Karen attempted to call the meeting to order, her voice was drowned out by a spontaneous, enthusiastic chant of, "Let him smoke! Let him smoke!" It was glorious. The power of the internet, combined with the primal human desire for delicious food and a healthy disdain for overbearing authority, was a force to be reckoned with. Even the legal eagles, perched nervously in the back row, started to look like they were reconsidering their client. Despite the overwhelming tide of public support and the increasingly flustered demeanor of the HOA's legal team, the legal battle dragged on with the stubborn tenacity of a pit bull with a favorite chew toy. Karen and the HOA, fueled by a potent cocktail of bruised egos, and what I could only assume was a bottomless well of legal fees, likely funded by years of meticulously collected fines for errant Christmas lights, refused to concede. Their legal strategy shifted, morphing from the initial, offensive odors argument to a more technical and arguably more flimsy claim of unapproved construction exceeding permitted dimensions. and violation of established property setback regulations. My architect friend, a wonderfully eccentric man named Bartholomew Bart Higgins, who viewed building codes as mere suggestions, patiently explained that my smokehouse, in fact, adhered to all local zoning ordinances. Every permit had been meticulously filed and approved. The HOA's bylaws, he argued with a flourish of his hand, were subordinate to the legally binding regulations of the municipality. But Karen wasn't operating on logic or legal precedent. She was driven by something far more potent, pure, unadulterated spite. She began a deep dive into my past, unearthing minor, long-forgotten infractions from my early years in Willow Creek, a slightly overgrown privet hedge in the summer of 18, a rogue basketball hoop left out overnight after a particularly enthusiastic neighborhood game. Each trivial offense was presented as irrefutable evidence of my consistent disregard for community standards, and my inherent unsuitability as a resident of their perfectly ordered paradise. The relentless legal wrangling, the constant threat of financial ruin, began to erode my initial enthusiasm. The giddy thrill of viral fame started to dissipate, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that settled in my stomach like a poorly digested rack of ribs. Even the most ardent Smokehouse supporters started to show signs of fatigue, their "free the ribs" signs looking a little wilted around the edges. Cracks, both literal and metaphorical, began to appear in my citadel of defiance. The sheer scale of the Smokehouse, while initially a source of immense pride, now occasionally felt excessive. The comforting aroma of smoke, once a constant source of pleasure, sometimes permeated my entire house, clinging to the curtains and even, according to my increasingly vocal wife, Susan, my dreams. Susan, bless her patient soul, started dropping not so subtle hints about the possibility of a slightly less monumental solution. Perhaps a very large, very powerful, but ultimately mobile smoker. Even I had to admit, in the quiet solitude of my smoky sanctuary, that the whole thing had spiraled a tad out of control. What began as a simple desire to barbecue in peace had morphed into a full-blown suburban Cold War, complete with legal skirmishes and viral propaganda. Was it truly worth the escalating tension, the palpable division that had settled over Willow Creek like a low-hanging fog? Then, I started noticing subtle shifts in the neighborhood dynamic. Mrs. Henderson's once vibrant petunias looked a little droopy, as if mirroring her own quiet exhaustion. Old man Fitzwilliam seemed more withdrawn, spending his afternoons indoors instead of tending his prize, winning and perfectly legal shade of beige birdhouses. Little Tiffany Henderson stopped leaving her construction-themed stickers, her usual scowl replaced by a quiet, almost sad expression. The conflict wasn't just Karen versus Doug anymore. It was seeping into the very fabric of Willow Creek, creating invisible fault lines between neighbors who had once shared casual pleasantries and borrowed each other's garden tools. The initial unifying joy that the Smokehouse had brought was slowly being overshadowed by the bitter taste of prolonged animosity. One particularly quiet evening, as I sat alone in my smokehouse, the gentle hum of the ventilation system the only sound, a profound wave of doubt washed over me. Had I crossed a line? Had my petty act of defiance inadvertently damaged the very community I was trying to defend against Karen's iron-fisted rule? The answer, heavy and smoky, settled in my heart. Probably. The catalyst for change arrived in the form of a small, slightly crumpled piece of construction paper tucked beneath my mailbox. It was a drawing from little Tiffany Henderson. A stick-figure version of me, standing proudly in front of a significantly less enormous smokehouse, sharing a comically oversized hot dog with a smaller stick-figure Tiffany. The simple, heartfelt caption read, "I miss the smell." And Mr. Doug's funny stories. That innocent drawing, more than any legal threat or viral meme, pierced through my stubborn resolve. This wasn't just about my right to smoke meat, it was about the kids who missed the neighborhood gatherings. The quiet neighbors who felt caught in the crossfire of our suburban battle. I decided to extend an olive branch, a peace offering seasoned with a hint of humility. I sent a carefully worded email to the HOA proposing a truce. I offered to significantly reduce the size of the smokehouse, to invest in state-of-the-art air filtration systems to eliminate any lingering factory offenses, and most surprisingly, to host a neighborhood barbecue, Karen McMillan included. To my astonishment, Karen actually responded. Her email, while still retaining a certain level of formal suspicion, was surprisingly conciliatory. She agreed to a meeting, stipulating that it be held in the neutral territory of the Clubhouse, a concession that felt like a small victory in itself. The meeting was awkward. Karen sat across the large, sterile conference table, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze unwavering. But as we talked, a subtle shift occurred. Perhaps it was the genuine wariness in her eyes, the almost imperceptible acknowledgement that this protracted conflict had taken a toll on everyone. Perhaps it was the sincerity in my voice as I expressed my regret for the neighborhood division. We hammered out a compromise. I would dismantle a significant portion of the smokehouse, retaining a more reasonably sized but still impressive structure. I would install the promised air filtration system. In return, the HOA would officially lift the blanket barbecue ban, replacing it with sensible guidelines regarding hours of operation and ventilation. And, yes, we would have a neighborhood barbecue, a smoky symbol of our newfound, albeit slightly strained, peace. The truce barbecue was initially tense. But the familiar sizzle of grilling burgers, the happy shrieks of children playing tag, and the shared appreciation for simple, flavorful food slowly began to thaw the icy atmosphere. Even Karen, after a few tentative interactions and a surprisingly engaging conversation with old man Fitzwilliam about the proper pruning techniques for miniature roses, managed a small, almost imperceptible smile when little Tiffany Henderson shyly offered her a perfectly toasted marshmallow. The smokehouse remained a slightly smaller but still proud testament to my initial act of defiance. It became a neighborhood hub, a place where the aroma of barbecue mingled with the sounds of laughter and neighborly chatter. But here's where the story takes a final, deliciously ironic turn. Remember Karen's obsessive deep dive into my past HOA infractions? Well, in her relentless pursuit of my supposed transgressions, she inadvertently stumbled upon a long-forgotten clause within the HOA's own labyrinthine bylaws, a tiny, almost insignificant sentence buried deep within Appendix C regarding architectural consistency. It turned out that the specific shade of whispering wheat mandated for all houses in Willow Creek had been discontinued by the manufacturer over a decade prior, meaning that virtually every single house in the community, including Karen's meticulously maintained residence, was technically in violation of their own rules. Old man Fitzwilliam, a retired lawyer who had been quietly observing the entire saga with a twinkle in his eye, brought this delicious piece of irony to everyone's attention at the next, and thankfully much more civil HO meeting. The collective gasp that rippled through the room was more satisfying than the first bite of perfectly smoked brisket. Karen's face for once was utterly devoid of its usual indignant fury. It was a blank canvas of stunned disbelief. The meeting dissolved into a cacophony of bewildered murmuring and suppressed laughter. The final tableau. Karen, a few weeks later, meticulously supervising the repainting of her house in the correct, albeit slightly different shade of beige. And across the street, the comforting aroma of applewood smoke, my new favorite wafting from my still glorious, now slightly smaller smokehouse. The war was over. But the delicious scent of rebellion, seasoned with a generous helping of poetic justice, lingered in the air. And every now and then, just for old time's sake, I'd fire up the smoker a little earlier, a smoky salute to the absurdity of it all. Just because I could. The revelation about the whispering wheat paint color sent a ripple of bewildered amusement through Willow Creek. For years, Karen had wielded the architectural consistency clause like a bludgeon, meticulously ensuring every mailbox post and fence conformed to the precise shade. Now, the very foundation of her aesthetic tyranny had crumbled due to a simple oversight. The paint didn't even exist anymore in its original formulation. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded once again, this time with a mixture of incredulity and schadenfreude. Memes featuring Karen surrounded by mismatched paint swatches flooded the feed. One particularly popular image depicted her looking utterly bewildered in front of a color chart labeled with increasingly absurd shades of beige. The hashtag FetBageGate trended briefly within Willow Creek, much to, I'm sure, Karen's silent fury. The next HOA meeting was less a formal assembly and more a collective therapy session. Neighbors who had once been at each other's throats over lawn maintenance now shared bewildered glances and nervous laughter. Old man Fitzwilliam, clearly enjoying the unfolding drama, even brought a bag of popcorn. When Karen attempted to address the paint discrepancy, her voice wavered for the first time I'd ever witnessed. She spoke of unforeseen circumstances, and the challenges of maintaining historical accuracy in color palettes. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic deflection. But even the most ardent Kareniac had a hard time keeping a straight face. The process of repainting began slowly, a neighborhood-wide admission of collective architectural sin. Trucks carrying various shades of white and cream rumbled through Willow Creek. The air, once thick with the scent of barbecue-fueled rebellion, now carried the faint, less inspiring aroma of drying latex paint. I even saw Arthur Abernathy, usually a man of few words, engaged in a surprisingly animated discussion with Mrs. Henderson about the subtle undertones of antique ivory versus linen white. It was a strange sort of communal bonding experience brought about by the most unexpected of ironies. Karen, for her part, retreated somewhat. She still attended the HOA meetings, her posture ramrod straight and her pronouncements delivered with unwavering authority, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. The almost manic zeal for enforcing the minutiae of the bylaws seemed to have diminished, replaced by a quiet, almost wary resignation. Perhaps the realization that her own house had been a long-standing violation had taken some of the wind out of her sails. Or maybe, just maybe, the shared barbecue and the subsequent paint-fueled camaraderie had chipped away at her rigid exterior. Life in Willow Creek settled into a new, slightly more relaxed rhythm. The aroma of barbecue became a more regular feature of the neighborhood air, no longer a symbol of rebellion, but simply the pleasant scent of a weekend afternoon. The Smokehouse, now affectionately known as the Smoker's Sanctuary, became a genuine community gathering spot. I hosted regular HOA-approved neighborhood cookouts, where the only rules were good company and an appreciation for smoked goodness. Even Karen occasionally made an appearance, maintaining a polite distance but accepting a pulled pork sandwich with a surprisingly appreciative nod. The long-term impact of the Smokehouse rebellion was more profound than I initially imagined. It wasn't just about barbecue, it was about questioning authority, about finding common ground, and about the unexpected ways a community can come together, even if it starts with a petty act of defiance and ends with a neighborhood-wide painting project. The rigid conformity that had once defined Willow Creek had softened, replaced by a slightly more tolerant, slightly more flavorful, and definitely more interesting atmosphere. Years later, as I sat on my porch, the comforting scent of ribs smoking gently in the Smoker's Sanctuary, I'd often reflect on the absurdity of it all. A simple barbecue ban had led to a monumental construction project, a viral internet sensation, a legal battle, and ultimately, a bizarre sort of neighborhood enlightenment. And every time I saw a house being repainted in a slightly off shade of beige, I couldn't help but smile. The Smokehouse Rebellion had not only secured my right to barbecue, it had inadvertently exposed the ridiculousness of the very rules that had started it all. And in the end, that was a flavor worth savoring. The lingering scent of rebellion, it turned out, went surprisingly well with a side of smoked brisket,